So welcome to the next episode of Endoscopy Essentials. It's again a special episode, Meet the Editor. You know, beside all the teaching we are doing, talking about fine details, I think we shouldn't forget clinical research. And therefore, I'm very happy to welcome David Weinberg. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
You are one of the editors of Gastroenterology.
I am and have been for the last 2 years with Paul Moietti. We're the co-editors-in-chief.
Why do you have two people, I wanted to ask?
Doing it now, I have no reason to understand how they only did it with one in the past. There is a lot of work. This is not a full-time job. And so I'm very fortunate to have a co-editor with whom I can work and we can split the responsibilities.
So do you apply together?
We did apply together. It was a rather rigorous process. I don't know how many teams applied. I hear through the grapevine that there were 3 ultimately. I'm sure that they were very good. And honestly, I don't know why they picked us.
Okay, well, there might be a good reason. Let's try to find out. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? Do you come from a family with medical background? And how you got into medicine and then finally into research and publishing?
Sure. Well, you ask about the medical background. Both of my parents were successful academic physicians. So I spent a long time trying to decide whether my interest was my own or trying to please my parents. I ultimately concluded it was my own. In the United States, unlike in Europe, the pursuit of a PhD is unusual. My mother, to this day, wants to know why I didn't get a PhD in addition to going to medical school. But I carved my own path. Why gastroenterology is a question I have lots of joke answers to, but I think the more...
Maybe you give her the best one.
I think the more serious ones are ones that I think all of our colleagues are familiar with. I like the idea that there are multiple organs that you are responsible for. I like the idea that there's a tremendous amount of cognitive skill required to do what we do well. And I do like the idea that there's a hands-on component. I'm not an interventional endoscopist. I still do plenty of what I guess these days is called conventional endoscopy, upper endoscopies and colonoscopies and the like. And really enjoy that ability in any given day to worry about the pancreas in one moment, the liver in another, and then doing endoscopy at a third.
It's interesting because, you know, the other specialties, they have one organ mostly. Right?
I make a lot of fun of my friends who are cardiologists. Obviously, that's not easy either, but you're right. There is that one organ, and with all respect to cardiologists, it beats. And the blood goes in and the blood goes out. And as long as it beats in the right rhythm, you're okay. Now,
it's a bit more complex.
It's a little more complex than that, but I do think that you're right. We have many organs to think about and a variety of different processes where they can go wrong.
So we are sort of the successor of internal medicine, general internal medicine, a little bit, at least below the diaphragm?
I think so. I have a real fondness for general internal medicine. My wife, another medicine person, is a general internist, and I think her job is much more difficult than mine.
I mean, we can't go too much into that, but what do you think is the future of gastroenterology in that respect? Because of the many organs and, you know, hepatology is different from IBD and endoscopy. Do you think it will break apart?
I don't think so. I do worry a little bit about the future of our profession in that, at the risk of sounding like I'm biting the hand that feeds me, endoscopy is an interesting skill. And clearly there's a lot of cognition that goes into doing it well. But at least in the United States, there is the risk, part because of the financial reward, of focusing on the technical aspects of endoscopy and losing some sight of not only that there's a patient there, but there's pathophysiology that you have to understand. And I think that should be a relatively easy force to counteract, but it's one that I do worry about. I also think that gastroenterology for the last 10 years has been casting around for something new to make our own. There was a movement probably around the world, but certainly in the United States, around the ideas of patient-centered medical homes. What aspect of disease belonged most squarely in the domain of a particular kind of physician? And for the most part, inflammatory bowel disease is the only thing, besides endoscopy, GI endoscopy, that fit into that group for gastroenterologists. Hepatitis C for hepatologists was for a while, but now most primary care doctors treat hepatitis C.
Yeah. Well, obesity.
Obesity, and that's where I was going. So I think the next great question is, and it won't be as simple as who owns a field, but it would seem wise to make obesity and nutrition much more something that is the domain of gastroenterologists than now. We're meeting at the time of the European gastroenterology meetings, and I heard a great talk yesterday by an endocrinologist about medications that are initially intended for diabetes, but now are clearly intended for weight loss, and
cure everything else.
And cure everything else as well. So I do wonder if we will embrace that role, because they're clearly, like in all GI, there's almost a psychiatry component to what we do. But there also is an endoscopic role, if you want it, for bariatrics. And then, of course, medical therapy is advancing.
Another broad field.
Another broad field.
Yeah, absolutely. So back to you getting into gastroenterology. Many people tell they had a mentor.
I had a wonderful mentor, but he had nothing to do with gastroenterology. Ironically, and I don't think this had anything to do with my entrance to GI or my own research interests, but he ultimately died of colon cancer. So that's about the only overlap between his impact and mine. I had a rather circuitous route. During medical school, I wanted to learn about public policy and how it was made. And
again, the bigger picture.
The bigger picture. Yeah. And this was the early 1980s in the United States. And I was fortunate enough to meet with a man who became my mentor, a man named David Rogers, who did all sorts of amazing things. He was the dean of the medical school at at Hopkins. Amongst other tasks, he was the first president of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. But he had come back to the medical school that he had attended and that I attended as a minister without portfolio. His background was infectious disease. He was very quickly tapped by the leadership of New York City and then by New York State to worry about this emerging infectious disease in New York, which we now call AIDS. So I spent a year between the second and third years of medical school being his eyes and ears. It was a very interesting time. I learned a tremendous amount about how policy is really made, how people will say one thing in public and do something very different in private. But I wouldn't have traded that year or the relationship I ultimately forged with Dave for anything. He was clearly my mentor.
And the fact that he died from colon cancer, he probably didn't go to screening.
Probably not. He was great at telling other people what to do, and probably not so good at taking other people's advice.
Just not atypical for doctors. Huh?
I think that's true.
Absolutely. So in gastroenterology, I think where did you start? In an academic institution?
I did my gastroenterology fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. My wife and I were not eager to leave Philadelphia. There was, at least for my ego I say, there was one academic job available in Philadelphia the year that I came out, and that was at Thomas Jefferson University, which is a very good place to get a job. And I was there for 5 years. And then had been working on a GI cancer project with some colleagues from the Fox Chase Cancer Center. We were putting in a grant to the National Institutes of Health together. And I thought once that grant was submitted, it was never funded, that would be the end of my relationship with Fox Chase. But they called one day saying, we need a head of gastroenterology. Would you be interested in coming? And I thought, well, this is great. We don't want to leave Philadelphia. It's 20 minutes driving the car this way instead of that way, all very convenient. I got to Fox Chase. The two other gastroenterologists promptly quit. So for about 6 months, it was just me, which was not good for patients and not good for me. But by now, 20 years later, we've built a program that I'm very proud of. And I stayed the head of GI for a long time, ultimately became the head of medicine. There was no department of medicine like there is in most centers because we are a cancer specialty hospital. So all of the internal medicine physicians were medical oncologists when I started at Fox Chase. Now, not of course just because of me, we have a department of medicine which to the disappointment of the medical oncologist has become larger than the Department of Medical Oncology.
That's unusual.
Well, it is, but it reflects the idea, and I think this is a good thing for the cancer center and certainly a good thing for patients. In the 20 or so years at Fox Chase, many cancers have moved from being lethal diseases to diseases that become chronic illnesses. And if we treat some woman with breast cancer and cure her breast cancer, but leave her with profound cardiac disease from her chemotherapy and don't know what to do about it, we haven't done her any favors. So having non-oncologists who operate at, hopefully, the same high level the oncologists do is great for patients. And certainly professionally it's been very satisfying because we've built a department with now more than 100 people.
But that also means you dealt with clinical research or research very early, and that brings us a little bit closer to, the gastroenterology and publishing thing. There are these two different areas of research. There's basic research, which for many is the holy grail, and a lot of money goes there, and there's clinical research. So can you make a point for clinical research?
Sure. So I chose, I don't know why, a long time ago, to follow a path that now has become increasingly common. So during my fellowship, I wanted to pursue training in clinical epidemiology, which these days is a much more common path for gastroenterologists, in fact, for many medical subspecialists. I was at these fancy training programs in the United States where all the fellows were expected to be in the laboratory doing, as you put it, basic research, which was never of great appeal to me. So I remember very clearly being interviewed for a GI fellowship at the Massachusetts General Hospital by Dan Podolsky, who is quite known to your audience. And I'd never met Dr. Podolsky before. I had been referred to him by the chief of medicine where I was a medical resident, another gastroenterologist, a man named Bob Glickman, who you may know. And they, of course, were all hailed from the MGH training program, starting with Franz Engelfinger and Kurt.
All the big names.
Yeah, so it was quite a collection of people over the years. And so I go and I meet with Dr. Podolsky in what to me seemed like the largest office on earth. And he interviewed me for 2 hours.
Oh.
And I felt like a bug being turned over. And at the end of the 2 hours, he said, I now really understand why you want to do what you want to do, but you won't do it here. Because we don't train people who want to do what you want to do. We train people who want to be basic scientists. And I respected that. I mean, I certainly didn't want to be somewhere they didn't want me or that I would feel uncomfortable. So ultimately, I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania. And was very lucky to be able to participate in a quite successful clinical epidemiology program that was growing at Penn at the same time I was there for my GI fellowship. So a roundabout way of saying I got to clinical epidemiology as the research focus for GI, but it started as a translational research project. I was interested in identifying people who might be at higher risk for pancreatic cancer. The biomarker, term we use now but probably didn't use then, that was interesting to me because it turned out with a little bit of research, it turned out that for the most part, there was the differential expression of cholecystokinin A or B receptors on pancreatic cancer and not in healthy specimens. You could pick up those receptors in pancreatic juice at ERCP. So we did this study where, and it wasn't me, I needed guys like you to do the ERCP. We collected pancreatic juice and in a case control study proved that there was very clearly a difference in how this worked. And that was a fantastic research project. It got me my first NIH grant, which then and now I was pretty proud of because I finished my fellowship with NIH funding, which is even then pretty unusual. And I was off to the races. So when I went to Jefferson, I needed to find a colleague who did signal transduction because I was still interested in this. That turned out to be a fellow named Scott Waldman, who I still collaborate with now, nearly 30 years later. And we became very interested in the guanylyl cyclase C receptor, which turns out is uniquely expressed in colon cancer. And we've exploited it to do a number of things, including, to this day, a variety of really interesting and we think hopefully successful chemoprevention studies. So I stayed on that cusp of basic and clinical research. There have been lots of other projects over the years. Some are much more clinical, but none are any more basic than that. I've always been able to find collaborators who do the lab part and I do the not lab part.
Well, I think the important message for even endoscopists, if you want to go into research, I think do some methodological training before you start. Because the usual thing is you do something, you're very happy and your perspective is very biased. And then your research is kind of case series type of thing. So that's a very important message that, basic research, you get a lot of training. Mm-hmm. You go through various steps, clinical research people fall into, and then, learning by doing at best.
Well, I think it's not advice I ever got, but it seems to me very common sense. If you want to be a research collaborator, and it's very hard to do things by yourself anymore, you do need to bring something unique to the table, whether it's a skill set like epidemiology or a laboratory technique. You certainly need the ability to collaborate. It's not easy to be on a team. It's not easy to say, this project will only be successful if we're all really expert at what we do, but it's our combined expertise that makes this useful. And to think that I need to be in charge or I need to be the expert of every component of a study,
that's gone.
That's gone. Yes. At least it's gone for me.
Surely. Also for endoscopic research, for sure. So I think nowadays, then we slowly approach gastroenterology. You won't be able to submit to a gastro journal as an endoscopist without the basic methodological considerations. And not before you submit, before you start the study.
Right. So, I'm sure you do too. Over the years, I've acquired all sorts of nuggets of information, and I'm a big fan of getting your biostatistician involved very early and getting the right biostatistician involved very early. You can find anybody who can do a power calculation or tell you whether that's significant or not statistically, but biostatisticians who don't even have to know very much about what you do, but they have the skill to be able to say, you can't ask that question with the data you have, but you could ask this kind of question. Has saved me any number of times. And I learned that early on. Penn was big on biostatistics. And I don't need to be the biostatistician.
That's
I don't
right,
even
yeah.
need to be the
Yes,
methodologist
yes,
anymore,
yes.
but I do need to know enough that I can say this doesn't seem quite right, and be able to understand when somebody who knows more than me about this says, no, you can't do that.
Very important message. I think there's nothing more frustrating to find out what you should have done when your paper is rejected.
Right, and so I'm sure our conversation will turn to how Gastroenterology, the journal, works. And
Yes.
one of the things that Paul Moietti and I think were selected for was a very explicit statement, and this is not to suggest it hadn't been true before, but every other either solo or joint editor team of Gastro before us had either alone or in combination had someone whose true interest lay in doing fundamental research in the laboratory. And Paul and I, neither of us can claim that experience and didn't try to. On the other hand, we said that we would put together a team, and I think we have, of people who do that and do it at a very high level. What Paul and I claimed, and I hope we're doing it, is that we would bring a level of methodologic rigor, whether it's clinical, translational, or basic, if those distinctions even matter, to every paper. We would find basic science associate and senior associate editors who were truly expert, and then let them, as it were, be in charge. And ultimately, Paul and I have ultimate responsibility, but let the basic science editors be our guide as to, is this good science? Is it science which is likely to have impact? Because Paul and I just aren't the people to judge that.
Well, I see. The question I often get is, what can I do to get my paper into gut gastroenterology whatsoever, not to speak about the big internal journals. I tend to respond maybe wrong questions. Which study is suitable for a journal like gastroenterology?
Well, I think we have...
From the endoscopic field.
Well, the endoscopic field, I think these days, at least under our editorship, I think we're certainly eager to publish more endoscopy. It really is an important part of what we do. We are very sensitive to the idea, at least our perception is that over the years, gastro has not been viewed by the endoscopy community as a place to publish research. If I'm wrong about that, I'm thrilled, but I think I'm right. And I'd like it to change. But as we've been talking about, it means that the same demands for quality are there. And we won't relax them even if this sounds great and this is the first study of 1,000 people with something where the number sounds very impressive, but the study design doesn't really answer the question. So I wouldn't, in fact, in this regard, single out endoscopy. I think that we've tried to move away explicitly, to the discomfort, frankly, of some people at the AGA, and we acknowledge this. We've tried to move away from publishing things that are purely fundamental science. Mm-hmm. There's a role for that. I think we've stopped that to some degree because of a recognition that the readership of gastroenterology, on balance, there are certainly individual exceptions to this, but the readership of gastroenterology is more interested in clinical and translational research than very fundamental research. The AGA has created a number of journals over time, sister journals to gastroenterology. CMGH is the most obvious, which clearly wants fundamental research. And I say this with great admiration for our laboratory-based colleagues. Your best basic science paper, you're not going to send to gastroenterology. If it's really great, and I hope it is, you're going to send it to Cell or you're going to send it to Science. You're not going to send it to us. And that's okay. In the same way, we would like to think that short of a paper that's going to be published in the New England Journal or Lancet or the Annals of Internal Medicine, because we know that we can't win that battle either, the very best, we hope, clinical and translational research in GI hopefully will come to us, although we have some very admirable competitors in gut and Lancet Gastroenterology and Hepatology, and I like the people who run those journals. I read their contents with real interest to see, what did we miss and why did we miss it, or things like that. But I think we know who our audience is, and we're trying to give them what they want.
No, absolutely. So I think it also has to do with the topic you're dealing with. So if you're an endoscopist and you have even if it's a well-done randomized study comparing two EOS needles or guide wires, it's not of interest for the gastroenterology community. Is that true?
Well, I think it's of interest to a subset of the gastroenterology community. The question that we always worry about, and it doesn't matter whether it's endoscopy or hepatology or IBD, is what's the impact? And I'd like to think we're the perfect judge of that. Of course, we're not. But to use your example, it's hard to imagine a study that compares two needles that do EUS biopsies and to conclude that needle 1 is better than needle 2 is not going to move, no pun intended, the needle in research or clinical care. And that paper should be published if it's good somewhere. But it isn't likely to have the same impact as something which changes, we hope, in small steps, clinical care.
And I think that's an important message if you work as mentors for young people, that I say don't be disappointed. It might be very important for us which needle we're buying and using, etc., but it's not of relevance to the gastro community. And the same is with the internal medicine journal. So if that's a very specific gastro question?
Well, I think that, it depends on your perspective whether this is good or whether this is bad. But there has been this proliferation of journals. Obviously, I don't need to tell your audience that they should stay away from the huge number of predatory journals that are no good for anyone or anything. But I think it's great that there are a series of truly excellent endoscopy journals where people with a focused interest in endoscopy know this is where I go to find the newest, best research that compares needle A to needle B. The same people who do that research are, on occasion, the same people who are doing more likely to have high impact research. And so I would hate for an endoscopist to think that, as we were talking about a moment ago, that they should never send their work to gastroenterology. I think they just have to be selective and recognize but it's got to be the big picture that we're interested in.
Right, maybe think about different questions. So what's the outcome if I needle a tumor versus not?
Correct.
Right? So go away from the mere technical aspect to clinical outcomes or other questions.
Right. So if you say, this needle gets enough tissue 82% of the time, and this needle gets an adequate biopsy specimen 64% of the time, and that's the focus
for
of the
determining
paper,
markers. And,
then we're not going to take that. On the other hand, some study that utilizes endoscopic biopsy to change the way diagnosis of disease is made, we want that one. So it's just a question of the sort of the scope of the question.
I think that was important to deliver that message. Well, David, at the end of this podcast, I would like to ask you a general question about publishing. I'm a little bit afraid that we are not in a crisis, but a lot of work we are demanding from our co-editors or, especially reviewers is free work. Do you think that can be maintained?
It depends on, it's a great question. It's one that we struggle with all the time. We are, and I'm sure every other journal is having the same problem. It's hard to find
Absolutely.
good reviewer.
Yes.
It's very hard to beat the reviewers up for not sending their reviews in on time because they are, in fact, donating their time. On the other hand, one would like to think, even in our somewhat jaundiced world, that that the rewards of participating in the academic enterprise works both ways. That if you send in a paper, you expect that your colleagues, generally anonymously, will put their best effort into trying to make your work better. It's a remarkably generous thing that peer reviewers are doing. And it wouldn't work if it only worked in one direction. So, we look for Thomas Roche to send us papers, but we look for Thomas Roche to serve as a reviewer. And I think that as long as both of those pieces are viewed by the author/reviewer as part of their responsibility, then it will continue. I wouldn't even want to think about what's the model to compensate a reviewer.
That's
How would
maybe,
that work?
That's
Right.
maybe a different podcast, but
Right.
perhaps we have to think about that in the future. Because it's my experience, it's increasingly difficult to get the people you want. And I end up with a list of 10 people invited in order to get 3.
Oh, well,
Sometimes
we have the
it's,
same problem. I think a different podcast, but a question that your listeners should think about is the economic models behind biomedical publishing are absolutely changing, and the impact it will have potentially on authors and on the institutions they work for, and certainly on the publishers themselves, are problems that are quite thorny, ones that everyone is dealing with. Generally, there are some very loud voices in this area screaming that open access is a wonderful thing, and there are some advantages to open access. But there are some huge disadvantages, at least for the journals that are publishing the best research. There was an estimate once that at Gastroenterology, I think I have the numbers right, we receive somewhere around 3,000 original submissions a year. We end up publishing about 200 of those. The great majority, of course, end up not accepted, but that's not the same as not reviewed and not discussed. And then for those papers that are accepted in the modern era, there's a print version, there's an electronic version, there's advertising that goes with the whole thing. So the cost to publish an individual article is somewhere around $30,000 US.
Oh, is that true?
Now, where does that get paid for? So, if you are charged an open access fee where you say that's what I'm paying to have my paper published, I have yet to meet the author who's going to pay us $30,000.
Yes, absolutely.
So how does that work? And I don't know the answer, but it is an answer that people have to figure out, because to say, we're going to switch from a journal pays, so to speak, viewpoint to an author pays viewpoint has some appeal. There are all sorts of issues. I mean, we've made it very simple in that we're just talking about the dollars and cents component. But the whole picture is very complicated, and it's changing quickly. So I'm a little worried about peer review, but I'm more worried about the overall viability of journals when the economic model is changing and the solution is not obvious.
Okay, I really love to end a podcast with an open question, because that gives us food for further podcasts. I thank you very much. I working for GUT, I can't say submit your paper to Gastroenterology, but we can conclude.
Well, you
submit
could,
your paper.
and we would have it on
Yes,
film. That would be great.
Right. Submit your paper to Gastroenterology or GUT. Is that?
Okay, that I can happily live with.
Thank you very much, David.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.